My daughter-in-law said to me, "You old fool, I only put up with you because of my husband." The dining room was warmly lit with a soft yellow glow that made the polished wooden table gleam. The aroma of roasted chicken, garlic, and freshly baked bread filled the air, and for a moment the scene seemed perfect. Family gathered, the chatter light, the clinking of cutlery rhythmic and comforting. He sat at the head of the table, the chair that had been his for decades, a man whose life had been a careful balance of work, responsibility, and quiet endurance. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. At 68, his hair had silvered almost entirely, combed back with an almost ceremonial precision, and his suit, though worn, retained a dignity that matched the calm in his eyes. He had spent years raising his son alone, tending to the household, ensuring that the boy had every opportunity to succeed. His heart swelled with pride as he watched the young couple across from him, sharing smiles and the kind of laughter that felt effortless to those who were younger, more impulsive, less wary of life. It was then that the smile of his daughter-in-law, the woman he had quietly tolerated and attempted to understand, shifted from playful to cruel. She leaned slightly forward, elbows on the table, eyes sharp and calculating. Her words, spoken so casually, landed like stones thrown at glass, shattering the calm veneer of the evening. "You old fool," she said, and the words dripped with scorn. "I only put up with you because of my husband." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The fork in his hand trembled slightly, though he quickly set it down, controlled. The laughter around the table died into an awkward silence, the younger guests exchanging uncertain glances. He could feel his heart sink, a heavy weight pressing against his chest, making each breath deliberate. Humiliation burned like a sudden flame, bright and painful, yet he forced himself to maintain composure. The words cut not only because of their truth in perception, but because of the arrogance with which they were delivered. The daughter-in-law had never been subtle with her disdain, yet he had never imagined she would strike so openly, so mercilessly, in front of the family. He looked at her calmly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to convey that he had heard her, but he revealed nothing of the storm inside. His eyes, steady and cold, held a depth that she could not understand, an unspoken measure of experience and endurance. He knew the power of silence. He had wielded it for decades when navigating human nature, when bending situations without revealing intent. Now, the silence became his armor, a quiet rebuke that needed no words. The guests shifted uneasily, sensing tension but uncertain of its source. His son, seated next to her, frowned and opened his mouth, but he hesitated. The daughter-in-law's smirk suggested she believed she had struck a victorious blow, assuming her husband's blood would rise in defense of her arrogance. Yet he said nothing, remaining still, his fingers lightly resting on the tablecloth, his back straight. His posture, the very definition of restrained dignity. Inside, his mind began to calculate, not in anger, but with measured precision. Every word, every glance, every past insult that had been endured quietly, now formed a mosaic of understanding that would guide his next moves. He remembered the early days of her arrival into the family, how she had smiled with a thin veil of charm, masking impatience and subtle contempt. He remembered the moments his son had praised her for qualities that were, in truth, performative, as if she were acting out a script written to elevate herself while diminishing others. Every careless word she had uttered, every condescending glance had been catalogued in the quiet recesses of his mind, a mental ledger kept for the day when the moment of reckoning would arrive. He felt no rush, only the slow, methodical awareness that the insult she had delivered tonight would not go unanswered. Yet, outwardly, he remained the perfect image of calm. He nodded lightly, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and his voice, when he spoke, would carry the warmth of a man unshaken by petty attacks, though inside a fire was beginning to kindle, controlled but resolute. The daughter-in-law leaned back, satisfied with the response, convinced that silence equaled weakness. She did not see the mind of a man who had lived through loss, disappointment, and betrayal, a man whose years of patience had refined him into a strategist. He continued the meal, chewing slowly, his gaze occasionally drifting to the young couple, yet always returning to her, measuring, assessing, planning. The insult would linger in the air, a shadow over the evening, but he bore it with the dignity of one who understood that the beginning of a storm was not revealed in its first gusts. The world might see only a silent, aged man eating quietly at the table, but inside a plan was forming, precise and inevitable. Humiliation had arrived, yet it would not remain. The reckoning would come, and when it did, it would be thorough, deliberate, and unmistakable. He sat in his study later that evening, the echo of the insult still ringing faintly in his mind, and allowed his thoughts to drift backward down the long corridors of memory. The house was quiet now, the clatter of dishes and low murmurs of conversation long gone. In the solitude, he revisited the years that had shaped him, the long stretches of tireless labor and sacrifice that had been swallowed almost invisibly by the ordinary rhythm of life. He remembered the day his wife had passed, a sudden illness that had stolen her from him too soon, leaving him alone with an infant son who stared at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The emptiness had been suffocating at first, a heavy weight that pressed on his chest, yet there had been no time for despair. Every breath became a measure of responsibility, every movement a declaration of survival. He remembered lifting his son into his arms, rocking him in the quiet darkness of the nursery, whispering promises he barely understood himself. Promises to keep him safe, to teach him, to love him without fail. Nights had been long and endless, spent coaxing cries into slumber, wiping tears, and nursing fevered brows. He had learned to cook, to clean, to balance work and child-rearing in a delicate, exhausting equilibrium. The kitchen, once a place of shared laughter with his wife, had become a theater of necessity, where he learned patience he had never known, where each meal was prepared with careful thought, each task completed with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night was a thread woven into the fabric of his son's life, a silent testimony to the love that he carried alone. He remembered teaching his son to walk, holding his tiny hands and encouraging each tentative step, the boy's laughter filling the empty spaces of a home that had once been full of two adults' shared dreams. He remembered the first day of school, the way he had smoothed the hair on his son's forehead, tucked the collar of his uniform neatly, and walked beside him until he vanished into a crowd of children. Every milestone, every scraped knee, every birthday party he had been there. He had been present not out of obligation but out of devotion, a devotion that demanded both strength and gentleness, a combination he had cultivated over years of being both mother and father, provider and nurturer. Those memories, vivid and raw, contrasted sharply with the presence of his daughter-in-law, who had entered their lives years later, radiant, confident, and entirely unaware of the depths of the foundation upon which she now stood. He remembered observing her early on, noticing the subtle ways she dismissed him, the polite smiles that never reached her eyes, the faint arrogance in her tone when speaking about his son, as if she alone understood him. He recalled the way she had corrected, the way he set the table, rearranged the flowers he had carefully placed, and suggested improvements to routines that had been the backbone of the household for decades. Where he had given years of quiet devotion, she offered only calculated charm, a performance designed to impress, not to sustain. Even as he watched her now, at the dinner table, he could see the echoes of entitlement in her gestures, the confidence with which she assumed command of spaces and decisions that had been earned long before she had entered the family. She had been tolerated, he realized, not out of necessity, but because his son had chosen her, because his heart still trusted another, because he had learned to temper his protective instincts with patience. He had endured her arrogance because family required it, because love sometimes demanded the suppression of indignation for the sake of harmony, for the sake of peace that might not otherwise exist. And yet, the contrast between his years of quiet sacrifice and her casual disdain was now painfully clear. The late nights spent nursing fevers and guiding homework were weighed against her haughty dismissal, the careful lessons in humility and responsibility against her careless arrogance. It was as if she had been unaware of the long lineage of care that had brought her husband to the point where he could now build a life with her. She had arrived at the culmination of decades of love and effort, taking for granted the unseen labor that had made her comfort possible. As he sat in his study, the memory of those years gave him more than sorrow or pride. It gave him clarity. He understood the depth of the imbalance, the injustice of her words, and the way her presence had quietly overshadowed the respect that should have been due. The fire of his indignation no longer threatened to consume him in rash anger. It was tempered now by reflection, by a measured understanding of the stakes. He had sacrificed, nurtured, and endured. She had underestimated him. She had insulted him. And in the stillness of that room, surrounded by the quiet testimony of a life lived with integrity and dedication, he began to form the slow, careful outline of what must come next. He moved from the dining room with deliberate calm, each step measured, each breath steady, though inside a storm raged that threatened to undo him. The polished wooden floors of the hallway felt cold beneath his shoes, yet he did not quicken his pace. Every movement was controlled, practiced, as though the very act of restraint were a skill honed over decades. He reached the study, a room of warm oak shelves filled with books, framed photographs, and memories, a sanctuary of quiet reflection and careful thought. Closing the door behind him, he allowed the faint click to echo, a subtle punctuation that marked the boundary between the chaos of insult and the serenity he now demanded. He leaned against the edge of the desk, fingertips brushing over the smooth surface, eyes closing briefly as he let the words spoken at dinner replay in his mind. "You old fool. I only put up with you because of my husband." The phrase pulsed through him, sharp, acrid, demanding acknowledgement. The daughter-in-law had spoken without fear, her voice crisp, her smile a blade. Humiliation had struck first, sudden and raw. Yet beneath the immediate sting, another sensation had begun to take root: fury. It was not a fury born of blind rage, but of calculated indignation, a fire that sharpened rather than consumed. His heart beat steadily, but behind the calm rhythm, a mind familiar with the slow calculus of strategy had awakened. He had faced challenges before, moments when impulsive anger would have ruined opportunity. Yet patience had always proven a more potent ally than fury unrestrained. He opened his eyes and surveyed the study, letting the familiar objects anchor him. The stacks of books, worn from frequent use, represented knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. Framed photographs of his son as a boy, the two of them smiling on quiet afternoons, were reminders of devotion and endurance. A letter his wife had written decades ago rested tucked in a drawer, words of guidance and encouragement preserved through time. These reminders were not mere sentiment. They were evidence of a life lived with intention, of care and persistence that demanded respect. And yet, respect had been challenged tonight by someone who saw only surface appearances, someone who assumed ignorance where there was intelligence, weakness where there was strength. He allowed himself a slow exhale, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease while his mind sharpened. Fury could have erupted in the dining room, could have sent him lunging to correct the insult or humiliate the offender in return. Yet he had restrained himself. That restraint was deliberate. He had learned long ago that true power lay in control, in the ability to observe, to calculate, and to act when the time was exact, when the consequences were unavoidable and complete. Impulsiveness had been the undoing of lesser men. He was not a lesser man. He had endured loss, raised a child alone, navigated both business and family conflicts with patience and tact. He knew that revenge, to be effective, must be patient, precise, and deliberate. The fury that simmered within him now was a quiet, disciplined thing. It did not claw or scream. It observed and catalogued. Each insult she had ever delivered, every slight, every moment of subtle condescension was recalled and indexed in his mind. He imagined them as pieces on a chessboard, each one positioned for eventual use. Her arrogance, her belief in her untouchability, was not merely irritating, it was a weakness that could be exploited. The mind of a strategist, long honed in the quiet discipline of years, began turning over possibilities, envisioning paths and outcomes, testing reactions, anticipating moves. He sat at the desk and placed his hands on the smooth wood, feeling the weight of deliberate decision pressing upon him. In this room, he was master of circumstance, not victim of insult. He began to outline mental scenarios, steps to reclaim dignity, to expose truth, and to assert control. Each plan was measured, considering timing, opportunity, and precision. He would not act rashly, for he understood the subtlety required. A single misstep could ruin everything. Patience was the tool of the wise, precision the weapon of the patient. Hours passed in quiet contemplation. Shadows lengthened across the walls as the late afternoon sun waned, yet he remained seated, motionless to the untrained eye, yet internally alive with movement and calculation. Each flicker of candlelight, each distant sound of evening traffic was noted and catalogued. By the time darkness settled fully, he had formed the skeleton of a plan, one that would ensure her arrogance and cruelty would meet their consequences, though not through confrontation or rash action. The fury he had concealed had transformed into clarity, a careful, intelligent strategy that would be executed with patience, timing, and unassailable precision. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile crossing his lips. He was not defeated. He was not powerless. The daughter-in-law had assumed superiority, yet she had misjudged entirely. What she saw as submission was preparation. What she thought was weakness was patience. And soon, very soon, the truth of his intelligence and careful planning would reveal itself in ways she would never anticipate. The days following the dinner unfolded like a careful chess game. He moved through the house with quiet precision, observing without appearing to notice, listening without drawing attention, taking careful mental notes of every word, gesture, and habit of his daughter-in-law. She was by nature unaware of the scrutiny, confident in her control of the household and her social image. She smiled, laughed, and spoke as if the world revolved around her perspective. But in truth, she left traces of vulnerability wherever she went. He noticed the small details. The way she tapped her fingers on the countertop when impatient, the subtle flick of her eyes when she measured others' reactions, the way she adjusted her hair repeatedly in front of mirrors, and the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw when conversations veered toward topics she disliked. Each detail was catalogued in his mind, forming a map of her character, her pride, and the weaknesses she so carefully disguised. He observed the interactions she had with others in the house. With his son, she was affectionate, yet subtly commanding, often guiding decisions under the guise of concern. With the household staff, she maintained a polished politeness, but a flicker of irritation or disdain would sometimes escape when she believed no one was watching. Guests were treated to charm and warmth, though he had noticed moments where the veneer slipped, revealing impatience and subtle judgment. These glimpses were precious. They showed him the cracks in her carefully constructed persona. He made mental notes, recognizing patterns and triggers, the times when her arrogance surfaced most sharply, and the moments when insecurity peeked through. He paid attention to her vanity, a trait as evident in her routines as it was in her interactions. She meticulously selected her outfits each morning, arranging jewelry and accessories with precision, as if every glance from a guest or family member were being judged and recorded. He saw how she would pause in the hallway to observe her reflection, the slightest nod of approval granted only to herself, and the delicate adjustments she made when she sensed that her appearance was being noticed by others. Her vanity was more than a harmless trait. It was a lever of influence she wielded over the household, her pride giving her confidence, but also revealing the small ways in which she depended on the admiration of others to sustain her sense of superiority. Yet even vanity held secrets. He noticed the small inconsistencies in her stories, the details she exaggerated, the embellishments she offered about her accomplishments, connections, and past experiences. She had created an image, a persona built to impress, to hide gaps and vulnerabilities beneath a polished surface. He catalogued these as carefully as a historian recording events, aware that hidden truths, once uncovered, were far more potent than surface insults. There were financial habits she concealed, discreet conversations with friends where her true thoughts about the family slipped, and moments of fear when she believed no one could see her struggle to maintain composure. Each detail added another layer to his growing understanding of her character, revealing both the arrogance she flaunted and the insecurity she desperately tried to hide. He also observed her interactions with her husband, noting how she wielded influence in ways subtle yet calculated. Her words were carefully chosen, her smiles measured, and her occasional moments of feigned vulnerability always designed to elicit reassurance or attention. Yet even in these moments, small signs betrayed her. A flicker of impatience, the brief narrowing of her eyes, the way she would glance sideways, measuring his reaction and adjusting her strategy. These small vulnerabilities were precious insights, keys that could later be used to turn her own tactics against her. He did not need confrontation. Observation alone revealed her methods, her priorities, and her blind spots. Even in her leisure, her habits exposed her nature. He noticed the books she favored, the magazines she read, the way she posted images online for attention and approval, all subtly confirming the personality he had long suspected. Self-absorbed, ambitious, and careless with truth when it suited her purposes. Her laughter, once pleasant, now carried a hint of patronage when directed toward others. Her generosity appeared performative, calculated to bolster her image rather than to genuinely support those around her. Each observation, catalogued in silence, became a piece of the puzzle. By the end of the week, he had constructed a detailed mental dossier of her behavior, habits, and hidden insecurities. He knew the moments when she was most vulnerable, the small cracks in her arrogance, and the secrets she believed were hidden from everyone. Each piece of intelligence strengthened his resolve, forming the foundation for a strategy that would not rely on rash confrontation, but on precise, deliberate action. The daughter-in-law remained unaware of the quiet scrutiny surrounding her. Yet her world was slowly becoming mapped in a way that ensured every future move would be anticipated, understood, and, when the time came, countered. Patience, intelligence, and observation had given him power, and he intended to use it without hesitation. The following weekend, the family gathered for a small celebration in honor of his son's promotion at work. The dining room, usually quiet on such occasions, was filled with laughter and chatter, the clinking of glasses punctuating stories of office triumphs and small victories. He arrived early, as always, carrying himself with an air of calm and quiet authority. From his seat, he observed the room, noting how the daughter-in-law floated among the guests, her smile polished, her movements deliberate, as though every gesture were part of a performance meant to impress and charm. She had no idea that the evening would be carefully orchestrated, a minor, deliberate disruption placed precisely to reveal her vulnerabilities. He had arranged for subtle but noticeable adjustments. A simple change in seating assignments, a small suggestion to the caterers about table placement, and an unnoticed alteration in the order of the evening's activities were all designed to create a situation where she would feel slightly off balance. To anyone else, these details were insignificant, inconsequential even. To her, however, the interruption of her meticulously planned social command would become an irritant she could not easily ignore. He watched as she moved to her usual spot near the center of the conversation, only to find that someone else had claimed it with casual familiarity, leaving her to negotiate for a new position without grace or authority. Her smile faltered ever so slightly, a brief flash of irritation crossing her face before she composed herself. She dismissed it with a laugh, attributing the disruption to coincidence or the carelessness of others. Yet he knew the truth, and he watched her reactions with patient scrutiny. The flicker of frustration in her eyes, the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped lightly on the tabletop, all were markers of the disturbance he had intentionally created. To an outsider it seemed minor, perhaps even meaningless, but he understood the impact. The daughter-in-law prided herself on control, on the ability to dominate social situations with charm and confidence. Even a small deviation from the plan unsettled her, forcing her to confront the fragility of her carefully maintained image. Throughout the evening, he continued to monitor her subtly orchestrated discomfort. A minor misplacement of a family photo on the mantel, a small delay in serving one dish, the rearrangement of chairs at the dessert table all seemed incidental, and she treated them as such, laughing politely and moving on. Yet each adjustment was a deliberate probe designed to test her composure, to observe her handling of slight adversity, and to begin to chip away at her sense of effortless superiority. He did not need to intervene. The effect was already taking hold in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He noted how her interactions became slightly more measured, the ease of her usual charm tempered by a faint awareness that things were not entirely under her control. Her eyes flickered toward him occasionally, unconsciously seeking approval or a clue. But he remained neutral, his expression carefully controlled, revealing nothing. He knew that the small humiliation had planted a seed of doubt, an unspoken recognition that not everything in the environment bent to her will. The daughter-in-law believed she was dismissing these disturbances, attributing them to randomness or the actions of others, but he observed the micro-expressions that betrayed her. Pride, vanity, and confidence do not vanish, but they waver when the illusion of control is disrupted. By the end of the evening, she had regained some composure, though the subtle impact of the disruptions lingered in her mind. She told herself that nothing significant had occurred, that she had handled the evening with grace, and that the minor inconveniences were simply the result of circumstances beyond her influence. Yet he knew better. He had watched her closely, observed the slight hesitations, the measured gestures, the tiny slips in posture that reflected her internal awareness. She had been shaken, though she refused to acknowledge it openly. As the family departed and the last guests offered polite goodbyes, he lingered for a moment, standing near the doorway, surveying the remnants of the evening. A quiet satisfaction filled him. The move had been small, almost invisible to others, yet it had been precise, targeted, and effective. He had exercised patience, intelligence, and subtlety to achieve impact without confrontation. In this first measured act of social manipulation, he had proven a simple truth. Even a minor disruption, when executed with foresight and precision, could unsettle arrogance and begin to shift the balance of power. In the weeks following the minor social disruption, he turned his attention to a more delicate and powerful form of influence. The daughter-in-law, confident in her control over appearances and the affections of those around her, remained unaware that subtle shifts were beginning to occur beneath the surface. He had learned over decades that the most effective manipulations were invisible, imperceptible to those who believed themselves untouchable. Direct confrontation was unnecessary. Patience, observation, and careful deployment of minor truths could seed doubt, erode certainty, and guide perception without ever revealing his hand. His first target was his son, the man who had consistently trusted his wife and whose blind loyalty had allowed arrogance to flourish unchecked. If he could introduce questions into his son's mind, doubts that appeared to originate from circumstances rather than manipulation, he could plant the first seeds of reckoning. It began with casual, seemingly innocent comments during everyday conversation. He would ask questions that invited reflection rather than assertion. "Did she mention that project at work again? I wonder if she handled it exactly as she described," he mused aloud one afternoon, allowing his voice to carry a faint edge of curiosity rather than accusation. His son, eager to defend his wife, had initially waved off the remark, but over time these small probes accumulated. The father-in-law never pressed, never insisted, only allowed questions to linger, subtle shadows that hinted at the possibility of inconsistency or exaggeration. Each remark was a gentle nudge, a careful test to see how his son processed information when doubt was introduced in the softest, most plausible way. He also began pointing out minor incidents or inconsistencies, framing them as coincidences or casual observations rather than deliberate critiques. "I noticed the payment for the catering was slightly different from what she mentioned. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding," he said during a family lunch, voice calm, neutral. To anyone else it would seem ordinary, perhaps even trivial. To his son, however, the repetition of small irregularities accumulated like dust on a shelf, imperceptible at first, then noticeable enough to raise questions. The father-in-law never accused, never forced interpretation. He merely illuminated what was already there, allowing doubt to emerge organically, giving it the guise of self-discovery. He further amplified these seeds by subtle social reinforcement. When the daughter-in-law spoke of accomplishments or recounted events, he would gently contrast details with facts already known, phrasing observations as casual musings rather than contradictions. "That is interesting," he would remark. "I seem to recall it differently, but memory can be tricky." To others, it was harmless conversation. To his son, it slowly introduced the notion that perhaps his wife's narratives were not as consistent or reliable as they appeared. These small manipulations were invisible to her, because they were neither confrontational nor accusatory. They merely existed in the space between perception and interpretation, a space easily exploited by a patient observer. In private, he subtly tested his son's reactions, gauging whether the faintest seeds of doubt had taken root. Discussions about family plans, social obligations, and household routines became arenas for gentle probing. He allowed questions to linger, stories to be partially recounted, events described from different perspectives, each time offering a calm observation rather than a judgment. His son began to notice slight inconsistencies, moments where his confidence in his wife's narratives wavered, yet he could not pinpoint a cause. The subtlety of the tactic was essential. Suspicion must grow from apparent reality, not from overt manipulation, or it risked collapse. Even in group settings, he continued to deploy these tactics. He would mention small, verifiable truths that contradicted the narratives his daughter-in-law offered, framing them as casual observations or memories from years past. When she spoke with exuberance about charitable contributions, he might ask, with perfectly neutral curiosity, whether receipts or records confirmed the stories, as if he were concerned for accuracy rather than questioning honesty. Each observation, each query was delivered with calm authority, and always with a plausibility that shielded his intent. By the end of the month, the effect was measurable. His son, once completely assured of his wife's sincerity, began to notice subtle inconsistencies in her accounts, small behavioral patterns he had overlooked before. Doubt had quietly crept in, originating from his own reflections rather than from accusation, making it far more powerful. The father-in-law, seated in his study or walking quietly through the house, observed these developments with satisfaction. Psychological influence, gentle yet deliberate, had begun its work. The seeds were planted, and they were growing, unseen yet undeniable, preparing the ground for the next steps in his carefully orchestrated plan of measured revenge. He understood that even the most meticulously planned strategy could falter if executed alone. While patience, observation, and subtle manipulation were powerful tools, there was value in enlisting discreet support. Allies could act as extensions of his will, gathering information, confirming observations, and quietly reinforcing the narrative he was constructing. Yet, he was selective. Trust, forged over decades of shared experience, was essential. He could not rely on casual acquaintances or those prone to gossip. Only a family member who shared his understanding of honor and discretion, or a friend whose intelligence and discretion equaled his own, could be a true partner in his subtle work. He chose his sister, a woman of keen insight, unflinching in judgment, and wholly devoted to the welfare of the family. She had known him since childhood and understood his principles, his patience, and his commitment to justice in its most deliberate form. He invited her for tea one afternoon, a casual conversation designed to seem ordinary while conveying critical intent. He spoke in calm, neutral tones, revealing nothing about his anger or his desire for retribution. Instead, he framed the discussion around concerns for the family, observations of behaviors that, while minor, hinted at potential disruption. He described events at dinner, small inconsistencies in the daughter-in-law's stories, subtle social missteps, and the faint tension that lingered after even trivial interactions. His sister listened carefully, asking questions that encouraged clarity, and he offered responses measured, precise, never revealing the full extent of his observations. Her role, he emphasized, without saying so directly, was one of subtle vigilance, to observe without interference, to note what might otherwise be dismissed, and to relay information when it could support a broader understanding of patterns. She would not confront, argue, or accuse. She would merely witness, catalog, and report. Her intelligence and discretion ensured that no accidental exposure could undermine the careful architecture of his plan. Once she agreed to the role, he allowed her to integrate quietly into the household routine. Family gatherings, casual visits, and conversations were now subtly monitored. She noted moments of inconsistency, documented behavioral patterns, and observed interactions between the daughter-in-law and other family members. Details that had once seemed trivial, slight hesitations in speech, expressions of impatience, fleeting looks of irritation were now recorded, carefully organized in her mind to be relayed at the right moment. Even the smallest lapse in propriety or truth could be useful if framed strategically in the future. The father-in-law also cultivated allies among long-trusted household staff, individuals who had served the family for years and who understood his values. They were careful not to interfere directly, but they provided subtle confirmations of his observations. A whispered remark about a contradiction overheard, an account of an unnoticed misstep, or the small ways in which the daughter-in-law attempted to manipulate routine household activities. The information they provided was discreet, factual, and devoid of opinion, allowing him to maintain objectivity while building a more complete picture. Together, these allies functioned as a network of observation and reinforcement, extending his reach into corners of the household he could not monitor at every moment. He communicated only what was necessary, ensuring that no one understood the full scope of the plan. Each observation gathered by his sister or the staff was a piece of a puzzle that, when complete, would expose the flaws in the daughter-in-law's arrogance and vanity without the need for rash confrontation. He also used allies to test minor interventions. When he introduced small social disruptions or planted subtle suggestions in conversations, he could later confirm their effects through discreet channels. A small smile of discomfort noted by his sister, a fleeting glance of irritation reported by the staff, or an unguarded comment from the daughter-in-law that revealed self-doubt all provided evidence that the plan was working. The careful orchestration of observation and confirmation ensured that every step could be evaluated and refined before further actions were taken. Through these strategic connections, he strengthened his position while maintaining the guise of normalcy. Allies were extensions of his patience and intelligence, gathering information without raising suspicion and validating insights that might otherwise have been dismissed. By creating a network of trusted observers, he ensured that the foundation of his revenge was both resilient and adaptive. The daughter-in-law remained unaware of this silent web forming around her, yet it silently tightened with each passing day, a subtle but inexorable reinforcement of the reckoning that was steadily approaching. By the end of the week, he sat alone in his study, a quiet satisfaction filling him. Every ally was in place, Every observation accounted for, and the first seeds of doubt and disruption had taken root. The plan was no longer his alone. It had become a living, breathing network of insight and subtle influence, poised to guide the daughter-in-law toward the unraveling he had envisioned with patience and precision. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when the discovery came, unremarkable in its timing yet monumental in consequence. The father-in-law had been reviewing some household accounts, a routine task he undertook out of habit and a desire to ensure order, when a pattern caught his attention. Numbers did not lie, and yet the records before him seemed to suggest a discrepancy that could not be dismissed. Small amounts had been diverted repeatedly over months, minor enough to avoid immediate detection, but cumulative enough to leave a significant trail. He traced each entry carefully, comparing receipts, bank statements, and household budgets, his practiced eye noting irregularities that would have escaped the notice of a less attentive observer. At first, he hesitated, wondering if the discrepancy could be a clerical error, a mistake easily explained. Yet the evidence was meticulous and persistent. Each record led logically to the next, a chain of transactions that painted a picture of deliberate misrepresentation. Funds intended for household expenses had been subtly redirected, small amounts at a time, always disguised as routine payments or adjustments. The daughter-in-law, he realized with a sharp clarity, had engaged in financial dishonesty, exploiting trust and appearances for her own benefit. The revelation was significant not merely because of the act itself, but because it revealed the depth of her arrogance and her confidence that no one would notice. He leaned back in his chair, allowing the weight of the discovery to settle. There was no immediate reaction, no emotional outburst, only the steady, deliberate assessment of implications. This knowledge, once leveraged, could alter the dynamics of the household in ways that mere confrontation never could. He understood that power resided not in exposure alone, but in timing and strategy. By withholding the information, by allowing her to continue unaware of its discovery, he now held a tool of influence more potent than anger or ridicule. It was a key, a lever, and the moment for its use would be dictated not by impulse, but by precision. The father-in-law began to consider the ways this secret intersected with other observations he had meticulously recorded. Her arrogance, her vanity, her carefully maintained social image, all were vulnerable to careful manipulation now that he knew the truth about her financial misconduct. The interplay between her desire for control and the hidden duplicity created opportunities that required careful planning to exploit. Any misstep could alert her to his awareness. Yet with patience, he could orchestrate a scenario where the revelation would be undeniable, leaving her reputation and credibility irreparably shaken. He also recognized the strategic advantage in keeping this secret to himself for the moment. If disclosed prematurely, it could provoke defensive maneuvers or attempts to conceal the evidence further. By remaining silent, he maintained the initiative, allowing the daughter-in-law to continue under the illusion of impunity. Every gesture, every decision she made unaware of his knowledge would now be influenced subtly by his understanding of her duplicity. He would watch, measure, and select the precise moment to reveal the truth, ensuring maximum impact and irreversible consequence. In addition to the financial discrepancies, he discovered traces of manipulation in her personal interactions with household staff and friends. Casual conversations, carefully orchestrated favors, and strategic withholding of information painted a portrait of a woman who had long relied on charm and subtle deception to navigate relationships. The financial dishonesty was merely the most concrete evidence of a broader pattern, a confirmation of the instincts he had long held. It was not the first time he had suspected hidden motives, but the verification through tangible evidence provided both clarity and opportunity. As he continued to study the accounts, his mind moved quickly through possibilities. He envisioned how he could employ this knowledge in the coming weeks, coordinating with his allies to ensure corroboration, subtly hinting at inconsistencies to test reactions, all while keeping the daughter-in-law unaware. This secret, once revealed, could alter perceptions of her completely, destabilizing the very foundation of her carefully constructed self-image. Every observation, every subtle disruption he had orchestrated could now be reinforced by undeniable proof of her misconduct. By the time evening settled, he had organized the information, cataloging the financial irregularities and their implications with methodical precision. He did not act immediately. There was no visible triumph, no hurried confrontation. Instead, he allowed the knowledge to settle in the quiet of the study, a silent weapon poised for deployment. The daughter-in-law would remain blissfully unaware, continuing her routines, speaking confidently, assuming control, all while the father-in-law prepared the moment when her carefully maintained facade would finally begin to crumble. Patience, intelligence, and strategic leverage had combined, creating the first major twist in the path of his subtle, inevitable revenge. The father-in-law understood that influence extended beyond direct observation or minor disruptions. It could also ripple through the social fabric surrounding a person. By carefully guiding perceptions in her circle of friends, acquaintances, and casual associates, he could create an invisible current of doubt that would gradually erode her confidence, authority, and sense of security. The daughter-in-law, confident in her charm and social acumen, assumed loyalty and admiration were constants. Yet the most devastating manipulations were those she could neither see nor anticipate. Subtlety was key. The changes he initiated could never appear orchestrated. They had to feel natural, coincidental, the result of independent perception. He began with small, innocuous observations shared with trusted members of her social circle. These were always delivered with the appearance of casual concern, never accusation. I heard that some details of her recent story might not align with what others saw, he would remark in passing to a friend of his sister, phrasing it as curiosity rather than judgment. The listener, naturally attuned to nuances of behavior, might remember small contradictions or fleeting moments of inconsistency, interpreting them in ways that seemed logical and self-generated. The father-in-law never framed these remarks as conclusive or threatening. He merely introduced doubt, the softest possible seed planted in fertile ground. He also leveraged allies he had previously cultivated within the household. Trusted staff or family members might casually comment on the daughter-in-law's minor inconsistencies or peculiar behaviors in contexts that appeared accidental or incidental. These observations were not framed as attacks or gossip. They were factual statements presented neutrally, like snippets of conversation overheard by chance. She mentioned it differently earlier. A staff member might note quietly in casual conversation, unaware that the phrasing and timing had been subtly guided. These moments, repeated over weeks, created a web of impressions that began to influence perception without raising suspicion. At social gatherings, he maintained a calm presence, observing while allowing small interactions to unfold naturally. A friend might notice a fleeting smirk that didn't match the tone of conversation, a small inconsistency in stories, or a subtle tension in her posture. To the casual observer, these details were minor, easily dismissed. Yet, when layered over time and reinforced by corroborating observations from multiple sources, they coalesced into a pattern that suggested unreliability, superficiality, or inconsistency. The daughter-in-law remained unaware, attributing the reactions of others to coincidence, fatigue, or her own imagined sensitivities. He also made careful use of suggestion. During conversations with allies, he would pose hypothetical scenarios that mirrored her behavior, prompting reflection and discussion that never directly implicated her but subtly paralleled her tendencies. Sometimes people exaggerate events to seem more impressive, he would suggest. It's natural. Everyone does it at times. These statements were designed to normalize the questioning of reliability in general, so that when others observed small contradictions in her actions or speech, their minds naturally linked the pattern without conscious awareness of manipulation. Isolation, subtle and gradual, was the ultimate goal. Confidence, social validation, and peer reinforcement were the daughter-in-law's greatest assets. By quietly undermining trust in these areas, he could force her to rely increasingly on fragile self-assurance. She continued her routines, unaware of the shifting dynamics, interpreting minor changes in behavior from friends or family as unrelated circumstances rather than the carefully orchestrated influence around her. Doubt, once seeded and reinforced, became a self-reinforcing force, guiding perception and behavior without overt intervention. The father-in-law also observed the effects of these subtle manipulations on her temperament and decisions. Moments of hesitation, fleeting flashes of uncertainty in social interactions, or unnecessary attempts to overcompensate for perceived missteps all confirmed that the psychological influence was taking hold. Each small reaction was catalogued, providing insight for further refinement of strategy. The more she struggled to maintain her carefully constructed image, the more predictable and manipulable she became. By the end of several weeks, a pattern had emerged. Her friends, previously unquestioning in admiration, now harbored faint but persistent doubts. Conversations once centered on her charm and accomplishments now included subtle hints of skepticism or gentle probing about reliability and authenticity. The daughter-in-law remained unaware of the origin of these impressions, attributing them to coincidence or miscommunication, never suspecting the patient architect behind the growing isolation. The father-in-law, observing quietly from the periphery, recognized that the network of influence he had constructed was functioning precisely as intended. Relationships had shifted, and with them, the invisible scaffolding of her confidence had begun to weaken. Patience, discretion, and strategic subtlety had once again proven more powerful than direct confrontation. By turning her social circle into unknowing allies, he created a psychological environment in which she was increasingly isolated, unsure, and vulnerable, yet remained oblivious to the source of her growing unease. The stage was set for further moves, each building upon the invisible cracks that now ran through both her social reputation and her self-assured demeanor. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, during a small family gathering intended to celebrate his son's recent achievements at work. The room was filled with laughter and the gentle hum of conversation, the aroma of freshly prepared dishes mingling with the warmth of a sunlit dining room. The daughter-in-law, radiant and confident as always, moved through the group with practiced charm, yet beneath her polished smile, a streak of arrogance persisted, one that refused to bend even in the presence of careful observation. The father-in-law watched quietly, his eyes calm, his posture composed, noting every gesture, every flicker of expression. He had been patient, meticulous, and measured for weeks, but he knew the delicate moment he had been waiting for would inevitably arrive. The spark came unexpectedly. A casual remark laden with condescension. She laughed lightly at a minor misstatement from one of the household staff, her tone dripping with superiority, before turning to the father-in-law with a pointed comment. "Honestly, it amazes me how you manage things here. I suppose some people are just slow to catch up." The words were designed to wound the subtle malice hidden behind a veneer of civility. They struck him not because they were surprising, but because they were consistent with the pattern of disrespect he had endured over years. His heart remained steady, though a flicker of inner fire burned behind the calm facade. The insult was deliberate, and he recognized it immediately as a signal, the perfect opportunity to justify the next phase of his plan. He felt the tension in the room shift subtly as the comment landed. His son, oblivious to the deeper history between his father and wife, smiled awkwardly, attempting to diffuse the moment with a half-hearted laugh. Other family members glanced between the two adults, sensing a minor unease but not understanding its source. The daughter-in-law, confident as ever, assumed that her authority and charm would allow the comment to pass without consequence, that the casual sting would be absorbed by someone she perceived as weak or compliant. But she misjudged entirely. The father-in-law's response was measured, almost imperceptible. A brief pause, a soft inhale, and a faint smile that suggested neither offense nor approval. His calmness masked the intricate calculations racing behind his eyes. He had anticipated this very moment for weeks, preparing the groundwork through observation, subtle disruptions, and carefully planted seeds of doubt. The insult she had delivered, though minor in the eyes of casual observers, served as a moral justification for escalation. It validated the patience he had exercised and clarified the necessity of action. Subtlety alone would no longer suffice. He allowed the comment to linger in the air, unacknowledged directly, giving it weight beyond its words. Social tension, imperceptible to most, thickened slightly as the daughter-in-law waited for a response, confident in her ability to intimidate. Yet the father-in-law's stillness carried its own authority. By refusing to react impulsively, he asserted control, signaling that her arrogance would not go unnoticed or unchallenged. The room felt the shift, the subtle vibration of anticipation that precedes a turning point, though no one yet understood its source. Internally, he reviewed the observations, intelligence gathered, and minor disruptions he had orchestrated in previous weeks. Each element contributed to a mosaic of leverage now ready for deployment. The daughter-in-law's arrogance, her vanity, her social manipulations, and now her blatant insult combined to justify escalation without hesitation or moral compromise. Patience had reached its limit. The time for action was approaching. The network of allies, previously aligned to observe and document, could now serve a more active role, confirming the patterns and ensuring that any revelation would be undeniable, strategically reinforced, and psychologically impactful. He also considered the potential consequences of action. Direct confrontation could backfire if executed too early, yet the crisis point provided moral and social justification. Her behavior had crossed a threshold, exposing a combination of arrogance and disrespect that could no longer be tolerated in silence. This event, seemingly minor to outsiders, was precisely the catalyst he had anticipated, an opportunity to escalate his strategy in a controlled, precise, and decisive manner. As the afternoon wore on, the daughter-in-law continued her performance, oblivious to the growing tension she had created. She laughed and mingled, unaware that her words had set in motion the next phase of his plan. The father-in-law remained composed, observing every movement, recording every reaction, his mind already mapping the sequence of events that would unfold. Her arrogance had reached its peak, and the environment was perfectly prepared for the subtle, relentless consequences he had been cultivating. By evening, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. The insult had provided confirmation, a tangible justification to escalate his careful plan. Morally, socially, and strategically, the path forward was now clear. The crisis had arrived, and with it, the moment to shift from patient observation to deliberate action had finally come. The father-in-law spent the evening in quiet contemplation, the echoes of the daughter-in-law's recent insult still fresh in his mind. He had reached a pivotal moment, one where patience alone was no longer sufficient. Subtle manipulation had prepared the soil, and now the seeds of exposure would be carefully sown. He understood that confrontation did not need to be loud or public to be effective. It could be precise, silent, and devastating, leaving the impression that truth had revealed itself without force. He smiled faintly, recognizing that the power of revelation lay not in accusation, but in undeniable, self-evident proof. He began by selecting items that would serve as evidence, each carefully curated to avoid suspicion of tampering. Receipts, bank statements, and minor inconsistencies he had observed in her financial dealings were arranged so that they would appear to be discovered naturally by those most likely to be affected. He chose locations that were both plausible and visible: a folder she frequently handled, a drawer she often used to organize household bills, and a casual stack of papers she would encounter during her own routine. Each placement was calculated, designed to catch attention without appearing deliberate. It was a delicate balance between visibility and subtlety, a task that required patience, foresight, and a deep understanding of her habits and psychology. He considered her tendencies carefully. She was confident, methodical in maintaining appearances, yet often inattentive to minor details when assured of her own cleverness. This predictability became an asset. He positioned the evidence in such a way that it seemed accidental misplaced bills, slightly shifted folders, or notes casually left in open view. The goal was to create a scenario where discovery would appear inevitable, a natural consequence of her own routines rather than the result of deliberate orchestration. The illusion of accident was critical. If suspicion of intentionality arose, it could undermine the psychological impact and allow her to mount defenses prematurely. The first piece was a financial ledger, subtly placed on her usual workspace, open to a page that revealed discrepancies she had carefully hidden. The second was a set of receipts, arranged so that their total reflected the redirection of funds, visible to anyone casually glancing through her papers. A third item, a note that hinted at minor manipulations she had performed in previous weeks, was left in a drawer she frequently accessed. Each element was placed with precision, considering angles of visibility, likelihood of discovery, and the potential reactions of those who might stumble upon them. He paused frequently, reviewing each placement as if reading a chessboard. Timing was everything. The evidence needed to be discovered in a manner that maximized psychological impact, ensuring that she would be confronted by the reality of her actions without the father-in-law needing to intervene directly. He visualized her movements through the household, the paths she routinely took, and the moments when her attention was most likely to be occupied elsewhere. Every step, every detail was accounted for, ensuring the inevitable confrontation would appear unplanned yet undeniable. The act of planting evidence was as much an exercise in subtlety as in strategy. He worked quietly, deliberately, moving items only slightly from their usual positions, adjusting angles, ensuring papers would not appear forced or conspicuous. Even the smallest misstep could compromise the illusion. His decades of patience, observation, and meticulous planning had prepared him for this exact moment. He understood that power did not always reside in overt action. Often, it was the quiet, invisible orchestration of events that achieved the deepest impact. Once the evidence was in place, he stepped back, observing the arrangement from a distance. Everything aligned perfectly with his expectations. The evidence was discoverable, obvious enough to be undeniable, yet placed in a manner that suggested serendipity rather than design. He imagined her reaction: initial disbelief, followed by growing recognition of her exposure, the subtle panic and self-doubt that would creep into her mind. It was a psychological moment he had constructed with surgical precision. As he retired for the evening, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The groundwork had been laid, and the next phase of his plan would unfold naturally, without his direct intervention. The daughter-in-law remained oblivious, confident in her continued control, unaware that the truth of her actions had been quietly positioned to reveal itself. In the architecture of revenge, this was a masterstroke. Evidence planted with precision, ready to expose arrogance and deceit, yet framed as accident and inevitability. The stage was set, and the collapse of her carefully maintained facade had begun. The evening was warm and filled with the low hum of conversation as family and friends gathered in the elegant living room of his son's home. The daughter-in-law moved through the crowd with practiced ease, radiating charm and confidence, her laugh clear and precise, her gestures refined. She assumed, as always, that she was the center of attention, commanding admiration effortlessly. She had no inkling that the carefully orchestrated chain of events had been set weeks in motion to reveal her own missteps at precisely the right moment. The father-in-law, seated quietly in a corner, observed with a calm intensity, his expression neutral, giving nothing away. Every detail of the evening had been considered, every move anticipated, and now the culmination of patience and planning was about to unfold. The first sign came subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet it was enough to start the cascade. She reached for the ledger she regularly used, intending to check a detail she had casually forgotten. It lay there, deliberately placed by him in a position that seemed casual yet ensured discovery. The angle of the papers revealed discrepancies she had previously hidden, inconsistencies she believed were invisible. Her fingers hesitated as she scanned the information, a flicker of unease crossing her carefully maintained expression. A mild tension began to ripple through her body language, her usually fluid movements faltering just enough to be noticed by those attuned to subtle cues. A family friend, casually seated nearby, happened to glance at the open ledger and raised an eyebrow. "I'm a bit confused," the friend said innocently. "These numbers don't quite match what I was told earlier." The comment, mild and non-accusatory, struck like a gentle hammer against the daughter-in-law's composed demeanor. She instinctively smiled and attempted to offer an explanation, her voice slightly higher than usual, betraying the rapid pulse of anxiety beneath the surface. "Oh, that must be a misunderstanding," she said, brushing her hands over the papers as if to erase the evidence of scrutiny. Yet every gesture, intended to reassure others, only highlighted the tension she could not fully conceal. Her husband noticed the slight irregularity as well, though his understanding of its magnitude was incomplete. He furrowed his brow, asking for clarification, and the daughter-in-law hesitated, searching for a plausible explanation. Her usual confidence faltered. Words stumbled. Narratives became inconsistent, and in a subtle but undeniable way, the cracks in her carefully curated image began to appear before everyone present. The father-in-law remained composed, the corners of his mouth lifting in the faintest hint of satisfaction. He did not intervene. He had constructed the scenario to unfold naturally. The impact self-generated by her own actions and the evidence she had failed to conceal. Other family members, quietly observing, began to pick up on the tension. A few glanced at the ledger, some at her slightly uneven responses, and a mild murmur spread through the group. No one accused openly, but the collective awareness of irregularities was enough to shift perception. Her reputation, carefully maintained through charm, manipulation, and selective social influence, was now under subtle but undeniable attack. She was visibly shocked, defensive, yet unable to pinpoint the cause of her unraveling. The father-in-law's orchestration remained invisible to her, a silent architect of her discomfort. Attempts at explanation became increasingly strained. Her gestures grew more animated, laughter more forced, and apologies less convincing. The social environment, meticulously prepared, responded naturally to these cues. Questions were mild yet pointed, glances lingered, and an undercurrent of curiosity and skepticism began to form. She had always relied on the belief that her social grace and intelligence would protect her, yet the constructed environment now exposed her inconsistencies without any overt confrontation. By the end of the evening, her composure had frayed considerably. The ledger, once a mere tool, had become a symbol of exposure. The subtle arrangement of facts, coupled with natural social reactions, had ensured that embarrassment took hold publicly, yet discreetly, leaving her in a state of confusion and growing self-doubt. She did not understand the source of the orchestration. To her, the unraveling appeared coincidental, the result of unfortunate timing and minor mistakes. She remained defensive, probing for reassurance, but the subtle seed of public embarrassment had been planted and had taken root. The father-in-law observed quietly, allowing the scene to unfold without interference. The daughter-in-law's fall had begun, not with a confrontation, not with accusation, but with the natural, undeniable revelation of truth, carefully arranged and meticulously timed. Patience, observation, and precise orchestration had created a moment from which she could not easily recover, yet the source of her humiliation remained invisible. He allowed himself a measured sigh of satisfaction. The next phase of his plan was now fully justified, and her social veneer had begun to crumble. He settled into the quiet of his study after the evening's gathering, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. The faint hum of distant conversation drifted from the living room, punctuated occasionally by laughter, muted by distance, yet carrying enough life to remind him of the family dynamics he had long navigated. He poured himself a cup of tea, its warmth seeping into his hands, and allowed himself a rare moment to reflect on the events that had unfolded. There was satisfaction in the chaos, quiet and understated, yet deeply satisfying, a recognition that patience, intelligence, and careful planning had achieved what impulsive reaction could never have managed. His mind wandered over the trajectory of his strategy, reviewing the deliberate steps he had taken with meticulous care. From the first minor humiliation to the planting of doubt in his son's mind, the careful cultivation of allies, the subtle exposure of her hidden misdeeds, and finally the public revelation of her inconsistencies, each action had been executed with precision. Unlike her impulsive arrogance, which relied on immediate charm and control, he had relied on foresight, understanding, and the slow accumulation of leverage. The contrast between his patience and her impetuousness struck him now with a sense of quiet triumph. She had always assumed the world bent to her will, yet the subtle manipulations he had orchestrated had proven otherwise. He allowed himself to acknowledge the moral clarity of his actions. The daughter-in-law's arrogance, her manipulation, and her repeated insults had not only been disrespectful, but had violated the implicit trust of family bonds. Each strategic move he had made was not born of malice alone, but of necessity, an inevitable response to repeated offenses and the careful cultivation of opportunity. He had not acted rashly, had not allowed anger to cloud judgment. Instead, he had waited, observed, and prepared, allowing her own patterns of behavior to provide both justification and opportunity. The elegance of strategy lay in control over timing, perception, and consequence. He reflected on the subtleties of human behavior that had guided his planning. Observation was more than seeing. It was understanding motives, predicting reactions, and exploiting the inevitable lapses of overconfidence. The daughter-in-law's charm had always been her armor, yet he had learned to see beyond it, to recognize the fragile architecture that supported her social dominance. In each carefully monitored interaction, each minor disruption, and every planted seed of doubt, he had exercised judgment and foresight, turning her strengths into vulnerabilities without her ever suspecting the hand guiding the outcomes. There was also a personal satisfaction in the contrast between his temperament and hers. He felt a calm certainty, a quiet authority grounded in years of experience and reflection. Her impulsiveness, once endearing to some and tolerable to others, now revealed itself as a weakness, an over-reliance on charm and immediate gratification, a failure to anticipate the consequences of her words and actions. He understood that true power often resided in restraint and subtlety rather than forceful confrontation. Every step of his plan had reinforced this understanding, and he took a quiet pride in the patience that had allowed him to maintain control over both his emotions and the unfolding narrative. He acknowledged a deeper, almost philosophical satisfaction. Strategy, he reflected, was an art, and in its execution lay a unique form of gratification. The interplay between patience and intelligence, observation and action, created a sense of accomplishment that raw emotion could never replicate. He had acted with precision, ensuring that every detail contributed to a coherent whole, that every action reinforced the desired outcome, and that the eventual revelation would appear inevitable, a consequence of her own missteps. The elegance of this approach, compared to the bluntness of impulsive reaction, was a source of deep personal fulfillment. Even as satisfaction filled him, he remained vigilant. There was no hubris, no assumption that the work was complete. She remained unaware of the orchestration, and the next steps of influence and leverage were already forming in his mind. Yet the knowledge that he had orchestrated the current outcome with subtlety and control allowed him a rare moment of reflection, a pause to appreciate the fruits of patience, intelligence, and careful observation. In the quiet of the study, with the family unaware of the silent currents reshaping perceptions around them, he felt vindicated, calm, and masterful. A quiet satisfaction born not of cruelty, but of strategy, realized to perfection. The father-in-law had long understood that influence over perception often carried more weight than overt action. The daughter-in-law, confident in her control over both social appearances and her husband's unwavering loyalty, had underestimated the subtle shifts already underway. Now, he moved to a new phase of his strategy, one that relied not on public exposure, allies, or planted evidence alone, but on carefully calibrated influence over the person whose opinion she valued most, her husband. By revealing only fragments of truth and carefully orchestrating minor observations, he could cultivate tension in their relationship without appearing intrusive, without ever stepping beyond the bounds of civility. He began with casual, almost imperceptible comments, phrased as neutral observations rather than accusations. In conversation with his son, he would mention incidents or inconsistencies in passing. "I noticed she mentioned one detail differently than what I recall from the previous week. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding." Each remark was designed to invite reflection, to plant a seed of curiosity and doubt rather than create immediate suspicion. He never pressed for confirmation, never framed questions as direct challenges. His son, accustomed to trusting his wife's narratives, initially dismissed these remarks. But the repeated, subtle observations accumulated, their weight growing almost imperceptibly over time. He also orchestrated small coincidences, positioning situations where minor inconsistencies in her behavior would naturally surface. A misfiled receipt, a misplaced note, or a casual mention of her past actions would be observed by both father and son, framed in such a way that it appeared incidental rather than contrived. The key was plausibility. Any suggestion of manipulation would alert her to the possibility of being watched. Yet, when the inconsistencies emerged naturally, the impact was far greater. Her husband, unable to deny the evidence before him, would naturally begin to question the reliability of her words, though he remained uncertain of the source of his unease. The father-in-law's subtle interventions were complemented by carefully timed encouragements for reflection. During casual conversations, he would ask questions that appeared neutral but were strategically designed to encourage his son to consider her actions critically. "I wonder how she would respond if asked about that event differently," he would remark with mild curiosity, avoiding any tone of judgment. The suggestion, indirect yet persistent, prompted contemplation without accusation. Over time, these repeated nudges fostered a growing sense of uncertainty in the husband, who began noticing small contradictions and behaviors he had previously overlooked. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law, oblivious to the orchestration around her, began sensing subtle changes in her environment. Conversations that once flowed predictably now elicited unexpected questions, comments that felt probing but lacked obvious intent. She noticed moments of hesitation in her husband's reactions, fleeting glances that carried unspoken doubt, and the slight increase in attention from family members during casual interactions. Though she could not identify a direct source, a creeping paranoia began to take root, unsettling her confidence and amplifying her awareness that she might no longer be in full control. The psychological pressure intensified because the father-in-law's influence was invisible. Every remark, every minor observation, every orchestrated coincidence was delivered under the guise of neutrality or chance. She could not confront him without exposing herself to risk, and she could not locate the source of her husband's subtle questioning. The tension between them grew quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it was profound, eroding the foundation of trust she had relied upon for social dominance and personal assurance. Even minor domestic interactions became arenas of subtle influence. He might casually remark on a discrepancy she had overlooked in planning the household schedule, or note in passing a slight contradiction in her statements. Each intervention was measured, designed to appear accidental or inconsequential, yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. By controlling the flow of information, he shifted perceptions in a manner that left her increasingly on edge, vulnerable, and unsure of the loyalties around her. By the end of several weeks, the daughter-in-law felt the first tangible effects of this invisible manipulation. Paranoia crept into her thoughts. Doubt tinted her perceptions, and even minor interactions with her husband were fraught with unease. She suspected a threat, though its origin remained obscured. The father-in-law, observing quietly from the periphery, felt a deep satisfaction. The careful orchestration of timing, subtlety, and strategic revelation had begun to turn the tables. He now held influence over the dynamics of their relationship, and her confidence, once unassailable, was beginning to waver. The daughter-in-law had grown increasingly uneasy in the weeks following the carefully orchestrated disruptions to her social image and subtle erosion of trust between her and her husband. Small inconsistencies, fleeting glances, and quiet questioning had begun to chip away at the armor of confidence she had relied upon for so long. The quiet satisfaction she once felt in controlling appearances and conversations had been replaced by a gnawing paranoia. She sensed the threat, though she could not yet identify its source. Her mind, accustomed to swift and decisive action, convinced her that the father-in-law was either a hidden adversary or the origin of the mounting discomfort, and desperation began to drive her toward reckless retaliation. It began at a family brunch, a gathering meant to celebrate a minor milestone of one of the grandchildren. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the aroma of freshly baked bread. She entered with her usual confidence, a radiant smile masking the tension beneath. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in subtle interactions, reading gestures, measuring responses. Every small discrepancy she noticed in her husband's attention or a family member's reaction fueled her rising anxiety. She needed to assert dominance, to silence any perceived challengers, and in her mind, the father-in-law had become the perfect target. With carefully rehearsed words and a sharp smile, she launched into a casual but pointed critique. "Honestly, some people here seem to struggle with the simplest matters. Perhaps guidance would help," she said, her gaze settling on him. Her voice carried just enough public inflection to ensure everyone nearby could hear, but she framed it as casual observation rather than direct insult. To her, it was a calculated attempt to reassert control, to remind the household that she remained socially superior and authoritative. She believed that a public rebuke, veiled as humor, would humiliate him and restore her dominance. Yet her execution was flawed. The father-in-law remained calm, his expression neutral, giving no indication of offense. Instead, he responded with a quiet, disarming remark that highlighted a minor oversight in her own actions. "Ah, yes. Perhaps we should all strive for clarity," he said softly, gesturing to a stack of documents she had inadvertently left incomplete earlier that morning. His words were careful, neutral, yet they revealed the first of several inconsistencies she had tried to conceal. The observation, subtle and factual, left her momentarily flustered in front of the assembled family. She had assumed her attack would disarm him, but it only highlighted her own vulnerabilities. As she continued, growing more desperate, she made a series of missteps. Attempts to regain control through humor fell flat. Sarcasm edged into insult, and her words betrayed a defensive tension. Family members, previously inclined to admire her confidence, now exchanged subtle glances, picking up on the contrast between her usual poise and the visible frustration. Each failed attempt at domination magnified her embarrassment. Her husband, who had begun noticing discrepancies and inconsistencies in her stories, raised an eyebrow, silently questioning the veracity of her statements, further undermining her authority. Her social strategy, once effective and carefully controlled, collapsed under the weight of misjudgment and desperation. Every gesture, every ill-conceived remark, accelerated the public perception of her arrogance and unreliability. The carefully constructed narrative of charm and competence she had relied upon was unraveling in real time. The father-in-law, seated quietly and observing, made no move to intervene. He allowed her actions to serve as their own condemnation. The fallout she could not control, and the brilliance of his patient orchestration became painfully apparent. By the end of the brunch, she was left visibly unsettled, her earlier confidence replaced by unease and a creeping sense of isolation. Friends and family, uncertain but perceptive, now questioned her behavior, her decisions, and her reliability. Her desperate attempt to reclaim control had backfired catastrophically, accelerating the decline in her social standing that the father-in-law had been cultivating patiently for weeks. She left the gathering flustered, defensive, and unaware that her own impulsive actions had sealed another step of her downfall. The father-in-law, reflecting quietly, allowed a faint, imperceptible smile to touch his lips. His plan had advanced not through direct confrontation, but through her own miscalculations, guided by the invisible pressure he had created. Her desperation, misplaced retaliation, and lack of awareness had ensured that her social collapse was not only inevitable, but self-inflicted. The timing was perfect, the orchestration invisible, and the lesson implicit impulsiveness and arrogance could not withstand patient, strategic intelligence. The father-in-law knew the timing had to be impeccable. The weeks of observation, subtle manipulation, and strategic planting of evidence had built a perfect storm. The daughter-in-law, already reeling from public embarrassment and the growing tension between herself and her husband, had been primed for the ultimate revelation. He had waited patiently, ensuring that when the moment arrived, the disclosure would not only expose her misdeeds, but also leave no room for denial, leaving her isolated and fully accountable in the eyes of everyone around her. The family had gathered that evening to celebrate a rare occasion: his son's promotion at work. The room was filled with the usual blend of laughter, clinking glasses, and casual chatter. Yet beneath the surface, the undercurrents of tension were palpable. The daughter-in-law moved through the crowd with her usual air of confident poise, though subtle signs of unease betrayed her awareness that something had shifted. Her husband's quiet glances, the slightly raised eyebrows of relatives, and the whispered conversation she glimpsed at the periphery hinted at suspicions she could neither name nor dispel. The father-in-law observed her closely, calm and deliberate, knowing the perfect moment for revelation was at hand. He waited until the conversation naturally turned to household matters, a topic that had been carefully orchestrated to ensure relevance. With the same quiet authority that had guided his patient strategy, he spoke up. "There are a few details about the household finances that might clarify some questions," he said, his tone casual yet precise, ensuring that the room leaned in with interest. The daughter-in-law stiffened instantly, sensing the imminent exposure, though she could not yet identify the source of his words. Her carefully rehearsed defenses faltered, her confidence waning as the attention shifted toward her. He gestured subtly to a series of papers, neatly organized yet deliberately positioned for visibility. Receipts, ledgers, and other documents revealed the financial discrepancies she had so meticulously hidden. Every irregularity, every act of diversion was documented and undeniable. The room, previously engaged in polite conversation, fell into a hushed silence as eyes moved from the evidence to her, registering the gap between her previous claims and the truth. The father-in-law's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the daughter-in-law's rising panic, highlighting the control he had maintained throughout the entire process. She attempted to interrupt, to explain, to reassert her narrative, but the meticulously arranged evidence spoke louder than any words she could offer. Her explanations faltered, inconsistencies became glaring, and the realization of exposure etched itself across her face. Family members, previously uncertain about minor irregularities or odd behavior, now had undeniable proof. The combination of visual evidence, corroborating observations, and the father-in-law's steady presentation left no room for denial. The truth was clear, and it was hers to face. The husband's expression shifted from confusion to a mixture of shock and disappointment. He had sensed tension, minor contradictions, and small inconsistencies, but the revelation made the scope undeniable. His trust had been manipulated, his patience tested, and now the evidence laid bare the true character of his wife in front of all who mattered. The father-in-law's strategy, executed with patience and precision, had ensured that the impact was maximum. Social, emotional, and relational consequences aligned seamlessly. The daughter-in-law's friends and relatives, previously inclined to admire her charm and social adeptness, now reassessed her in an instant. Whispers filled the air, not malicious but factual, an organic reflection of shock and recognition. Her carefully constructed image of competence, control, and virtue crumbled as the evidence exposed a pattern of deception, manipulation, and selfishness. The father-in-law observed quietly, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his eyes, knowing that patience, strategy, and intelligence had triumphed over arrogance and impulsiveness. Even in the face of exposure, she struggled to maintain control, but the tide was irreversible. Her past misdeeds, once hidden behind charm and clever manipulation, were now fully visible to those who mattered. She faced not only public shame, but also the collapse of her carefully maintained social standing, the disintegration of trust within her marriage, and the awareness that her attempts at domination had been meticulously anticipated and countered. The father-in-law, silent yet omnipresent, had engineered the moment so that the consequences of her actions were unavoidable, visible, and undeniable. As the room absorbed the revelation, he allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The climactic twist was complete. The daughter-in-law's true nature had been revealed, her social and personal authority dismantled, and the family finally understood the depth of her duplicity. Calm, patient, and intelligent, he had orchestrated every step with precision, ensuring that justice, subtle yet absolute, had been served. In that moment, he felt the culmination of weeks of strategy, the satisfaction of seeing truth emerge in its purest, most undeniable form. The days following the climactic revelation were quiet, almost serene, yet they carried the weight of permanent change. The daughter-in-law moved through the household and social spaces with a visible tremor in her confidence, each step measured and cautious. She had been exposed, her carefully curated image shattered, her manipulations laid bare in a way that was undeniable, yet subtle enough to appear the natural consequence of her own actions. She had lost control, and with it, the social and emotional power she once wielded effortlessly. The father-in-law observed her from a distance, maintaining the same composed, dignified demeanor he had displayed throughout the entire process. There was no gloating, no visible vindictiveness, only a quiet, resolute authority that radiated strength, patience, and moral clarity. His satisfaction was intellectual and psychological rather than emotional. He did not revel in her humiliation for its own sake. Instead, he recognized the elegance of the strategy he had employed. Every step observation, subtle manipulation, planting of evidence, influencing relationships, and strategic timing had culminated in a moment where truth revealed itself with absolute clarity. The daughter-in-law, once proud and imperious, now confronted the consequences of her own choices, entirely of her own making. She was humiliated, isolated, and uncertain, yet the orchestrator of her downfall remained invisible, a ghostly presence who had never stooped to overt cruelty or confrontation. The ultimate victory lay in this invisibility, the demonstration that control, patience, and intelligence could outmaneuver arrogance, impulsiveness, and deceit. Every interaction she now had within the family carried a subtle weight. Relatives and friends, having witnessed the exposure, were careful and measured in their words, their expressions a reflection of awareness rather than judgmental ridicule. Her husband, once blinded by trust and affection, had begun to see the depth of her duplicity, the small manipulations and falsehoods that had been hidden behind charm and practiced composure. He did not confront her angrily. He observed, processed, and learned. The father-in-law's quiet orchestration allowed him to recognize the truth without public drama or overt accusation, a lesson in strategic patience and moral intelligence. The daughter-in-law's attempts to regain her footing were halting, hesitant, and ineffective. Her prior arrogance, which had once allowed her to navigate social circles effortlessly, now worked against her. Even casual interactions carried the shadow of doubt. She could sense that the perception of others had shifted permanently, and she was powerless to reverse it. Each time she attempted to assert authority or charm, it faltered subtly yet unmistakably. The psychological impact of being exposed without a visible adversary weighed heavily upon her, reinforcing the lesson of humility and restraint she had stubbornly refused to learn before. The father-in-law, observing all of this, maintained his calm composure. He engaged with her politely when necessary, never betraying satisfaction openly, never allowing her to perceive the orchestration behind the events. His presence was steady, morally unassailable, and strategically positioned to reinforce the invisible structure of control he had established. Every act, every decision he had taken, served to elevate his own moral and psychological standing while allowing the daughter-in-law to confront her own failures and misjudgments. The balance of power had shifted decisively, and it was achieved without a single moment of overt malice. His son, now fully aware of the depth and precision of his father's actions, approached him privately. There was a quiet respect in his tone, a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "I can see now how carefully you handled everything," he said. "You didn't just expose the truth. You protected the family, guided me, and ensured the outcome was undeniable yet fair." The father-in-law nodded slightly, acknowledging the recognition but remaining modest, letting the weight of his strategy speak for itself. The lesson for his son was clear. Intelligence, patience, and moral clarity could resolve even the most delicate challenges without resorting to open conflict or hostility. The household gradually settled into a new equilibrium. The daughter-in-law, humbled and cautious, learned to navigate her environment with care, awareness, and restraint. She had been defeated not by aggression, but by superior strategy, subtlety, and psychological insight. The father-in-law retained dignity and moral authority, unchallenged and unassailable, his influence now fully acknowledged by those around him. The revenge, complete in its precision, left her humbled, isolated and aware, while he remained the calm, morally upright observer who had orchestrated the entire outcome with masterful discretion. In the end, the ultimate lesson was clear. Patience, intelligence, and careful orchestration could achieve what impulsive action and arrogance could not. Justice, subtle and precise, had been served, and the family emerged with clarity, respect, and restored balance. The house was quieter than usual in the days following the climactic revelation. Conversations were subdued, laughter softer, and the usual ease that had once characterized family gatherings seemed to have evaporated. The daughter-in-law moved through the rooms with a cautious, almost hesitant step, her head held high only in appearance, masking the turmoil beneath. For the first time in years, she felt the full weight of her own actions. Her arrogance, manipulations, and calculated social maneuvering had all been exposed, and there was no one left to shield her from the consequences. The father-in-law's subtle orchestration had left her isolated, unsure, and compelled to confront the reality she had long avoided. Humility was no longer optional, it was necessary. In private, she spent hours reflecting on the events that had led to her downfall. She examined her past decisions, recalling each act of deception, every insult delivered to those she underestimated, and the countless moments when charm had allowed her to bypass accountability. At first, her thoughts were defensive, filled with rationalizations and excuses. Perhaps she told herself that the father-in-law had been unfair, that the family's attention had been misplaced, that misunderstandings had simply compounded. But the evidence was undeniable, the consequences real, and the quiet effectiveness of his strategy was inescapable. With each recollection, the layers of pride and arrogance began to peel away, revealing a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. The social isolation, subtle as it was, intensified her introspection. Friends and relatives, once admirers of her elegance and wit, now treated her with polite caution, keeping interactions measured and neutral. Even her husband, who had previously been unaware of her duplicity, now observed her with a careful, evaluating gaze. This shift in perception forced her to confront not only her own behavior, but also the underlying assumptions that had guided her relationships. She realized that manipulation and charm were temporary tools, ineffective against patience, intelligence, and careful planning. Her previous sense of invulnerability was gone, replaced by a humbling awareness of her own limitations. The father-in-law remained in his usual position, calm, dignified, and morally unassailable. He did not gloat, did not offer commentary, and never reminded her of the lessons she had learned through experience. His presence alone was a constant reminder of the contrast between impulsive arrogance and patient intelligence. Observing him, she could not help but recognize the qualities that had allowed him to orchestrate the entire sequence of events with subtlety and precision, foresight, patience, and a profound understanding of human nature. Each reflection reinforced the magnitude of her own miscalculations and the wisdom of restraint, humility, and respect. Gradually, the daughter-in-law's inner dialogue shifted from denial to acceptance. She understood that her previous behaviors had consequences far beyond her immediate awareness, and that the subtle but undeniable pressure exerted by her father-in-law had forced her into a confrontation with reality she could no longer avoid. Her pride had been tempered not through open confrontation or humiliation, but through the quiet, deliberate orchestration of events that revealed the truth with clarity and inevitability. The psychological weight of recognition, combined with the social cues surrounding her, demanded introspection and humility. Each interaction became an opportunity for learning. She began to listen more carefully, observe without assumption, and consider the perspectives of others. The impulsive arrogance that had once guided her decisions was replaced by cautious reflection. Even minor tasks and conversations became exercises in awareness, a daily reminder of the lessons she had been forced to confront. Her internal transformation, though gradual, was profound. The arrogance that had once insulated her from accountability now served as a mirror, reflecting her growth, awareness, and emerging humility. By the end of weeks, the daughter-in-law's demeanor had shifted. The sharpness in her voice softened, the quickness to judgment and insult diminished, and the confidence she displayed was tempered by awareness and self-reflection. She was no longer the unassailable figure she had once believed herself to be. She had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions, to acknowledge the intelligence and patience of her father-in-law, and to learn humility through experience. Though the journey had been difficult and the revelations uncomfortable, the transformation was real, deep, and enduring. In the quiet of her own thoughts, she finally understood what had eluded her for so long. Respect, trust, and influence could not be commanded through arrogance or charm. They had to be earned. Forced into humility, she reflected, learned, and began the slow process of reconstructing herself not as a manipulator or deceiver, but as someone tempered by the subtle, undeniable lessons of consequence, strategy, and moral intelligence. Sitting alone in the quiet of his study, the father-in-law allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The house, usually filled with the bustle of conversation, laughter, and occasional tension, had settled into a calm that seemed almost reverential. The daughter-in-law's transformation, subtle yet profound, had unfolded exactly as he had envisioned, guided by patience, intelligence, and careful observation. The culmination of weeks of planning and subtle orchestration offered him more than satisfaction. It offered insight into the nature of human behavior, the power of restraint, and the art of justice executed without overt malice. He thought first of patience. The weeks of waiting, observing, and gathering information had not been idle. Each day, each minor incident, had provided critical insight into the daughter-in-law's character, habits, and vulnerabilities. He had learned that patience was not simply a passive exercise, but an active strategy, an essential tool for understanding human nature, predicting responses, and designing outcomes that could not be hurried without risk of error. The most devastating consequences, he reflected, were often those that unfolded slowly, guided by careful calculation rather than impulsive emotion. In allowing events to progress naturally, he had ensured that the lessons were internalized, undeniable, and permanent. Wisdom had guided every decision. He had relied not on brute force, anger, or confrontation, but on subtlety, precision, and moral clarity. Each action, from observing the daughter-in-law's behavior to planting evidence, influencing relationships, and orchestrating her exposure, had been measured and deliberate. Wisdom, he understood, required the ability to see beyond immediate appearances, to understand both motive and consequence, and to anticipate outcomes with clarity. The beauty of the strategy lay not in overt victory, but in the invisible threads connecting observation, action, and revelation, weaving a tapestry in which justice emerged naturally and undeniably. Justice, in its truest form, had been served not through humiliation for its own sake, but through careful orchestration that allowed truth to reveal itself. The daughter-in-law had confronted her own misdeeds, reflected on her arrogance, and been forced into humility, all without a single moment of overt accusation from him. In this, he recognized that true revenge or true justice was not about spectacle or vengeance. It was about precision, timing, and moral balance. A subtle, intelligent, and controlled approach ensured that outcomes were both effective and ethically defensible, leaving the perpetrator accountable while the orchestrator remained dignified. He reflected on the psychological elements that had made the strategy successful. Observation, discretion, and patience had allowed him to influence perceptions and guide consequences without ever appearing malicious. The daughter-in-law's own missteps, impulsiveness, and arrogance had provided the material, but it was his careful design that ensured the results were inevitable and instructive. He understood that intelligence, foresight, and moral clarity could achieve far more than anger, aggression, or confrontation ever could. The quiet orchestration of events, he mused, left a mark deeper and more enduring than any public spectacle of retribution could have. His thoughts returned to the family. The son, who had observed the subtle unfolding of events, now understood the depth of his father's strategy and appreciated the wisdom and intelligence that guided it. The daughter-in-law, humbled and reflective, had begun the slow process of internalizing the lessons, learning the value of humility, integrity, and careful thought. The household itself had regained balance, not through coercion or fear, but through the natural consequence of truth revealed and respect restored. In this, he saw the ultimate affirmation of the approach he had taken. Subtlety, intelligence, and moral clarity had created lasting transformation. As he sipped his tea, he considered the broader moral. Life, he realized, rarely demanded rash action or immediate confrontation. The most profound victories, those that teach lessons, correct wrongs, and restore balance, required strategy, patience, and intelligence. True revenge was not visible aggression, nor was it loud vindication. It was quiet, deliberate, and measured. It relied on understanding human nature, anticipating behavior, and guiding events so that justice emerged naturally, inevitably, and undeniably. He smiled faintly, acknowledging the invisible threads he had woven, the lessons imparted, and the enduring satisfaction of orchestrating outcomes without malice. Patience, wisdom, and subtle justice had prevailed. And in that quiet reflection, he understood the essence of true power, control, insight, and the quiet knowledge that the right course, executed intelligently, always achieves its purpose. The afternoon sun spilled through the windows, casting a warm golden glow over the family gathering. Laughter and chatter filled the room, lighter now than before, but carrying a calm, measured energy that reflected the restored equilibrium within the household. The daughter-in-law moved among the family with careful grace, her previous arrogance tempered by humility and reflection. She had learned, slowly but unmistakably, that her actions had consequences she could not evade. The tension that had defined prior gatherings had been replaced by cautious interactions, polite smiles, and an undercurrent of awareness that subtly altered the social dynamics she had once dominated. The father-in-law sat quietly in his customary spot at the far end of the room, his posture relaxed yet dignified, his eyes attentive but unobtrusive. The room's energy, though seemingly light, was charged with the quiet acknowledgement of balance restored. He did not need to assert authority. His presence alone conveyed control and moral clarity. Every glance, every subtle observation he made reinforced the unspoken hierarchy that had shifted in his favor. The lessons delivered through patience, intelligence, and subtle strategy had taken root, reshaping relationships and social awareness without overt confrontation. His son, seated near the center, carried a serene expression. No words were needed to convey his understanding and respect for his father's approach. He had observed a careful orchestration unfold, recognized the wisdom of patient strategy, and appreciated the moral clarity guiding each move. The tension between family members had eased, and he now approached interactions with thoughtful caution, aware that justice had been served not through public spectacle, but through subtle, undeniable guidance. In watching his father, he recognized a lesson in both prudence and power, a reminder that intelligence, patience, and careful observation often outweighed impulsive action or open confrontation. The daughter-in-law's steps through the gathering were measured, deliberate. Her previous confidence, now tempered by reflection, lent a quiet grace to her movements. She interacted with family members carefully, listening more than speaking, considering each word before it left her lips. The small missteps, inconsistencies, and arrogance that had once defined her presence were gone, replaced by humility and awareness. She understood deeply that the balance of respect had shifted. She could no longer command authority through charm alone, and the social environment now reflected her accountability. Across the room, subtle gestures and glances reinforced this shift. Family members, previously deferential to her presence, now responded to her with polite attentiveness rather than unquestioned admiration. The father-in-law noted each interaction quietly, his satisfaction measured and internal. He did not need applause or acknowledgement. The subtle influence he had cultivated over weeks had permanently reshaped perceptions, attitudes, and relationships. The calm after the storm was a testament to his patient strategy, the quiet culmination of intelligence, foresight, and moral authority. The daughter-in-law, unaware of the full extent of the orchestration, nevertheless sensed the changed atmosphere. There was no overt hostility, no malicious confrontation, yet she could not ignore the subtle cues that revealed a recalibration of respect. Her reflection in these interactions reinforced the lessons she had learned. Humility, careful thought, and the consequences of misjudgment were now internalized. Each polite smile, measured response, and thoughtful conversation reminded her that she was no longer the unchallenged center of control. The quiet shift was undeniable, yet accomplished without the need for public humiliation or direct confrontation. The father-in-law, sipping his tea and observing the room, allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. It was the kind of smile that spoke of quiet triumph, satisfaction without arrogance, and the deep contentment of a strategy executed perfectly. He had maintained his dignity, upheld moral clarity, and achieved complete resolution without ever appearing malicious. Every interaction around him now reinforced the balance he had patiently cultivated, leaving the daughter-in-law humbled, the son respectful, and the family dynamic restored. As the gathering continued, the warmth of family conversation filled the room, unhurried and genuine. The lessons had been delivered, the consequences internalized, and the equilibrium established. In that serene environment, the father-in-law quietly observed, fully aware of the subtle power he held and the wisdom he had exercised. His victory was complete, invisible yet undeniable, and the calm after the storm reflected the true effectiveness of patience, intelligence, and controlled strategy. In that moment, he understood the profound satisfaction of achieving justice without aggression, of shaping outcomes with subtlety, and of restoring balance through quiet authority. the room, filled with the soft hum of family life, carried the invisible imprint of his actions, a testament to the enduring power of careful planning, moral clarity, and the quiet triumph of intelligence over impulsiveness. The storm had passed, and in its wake, only harmony, respect, and a measured sense of justice remained. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.